All right, so this is going to be part one of Deficits of Trust by Adam Rodgers, as read by its author, who's me. And this part is called A History of Violence Ignored. The man who would kill 22 of his fellow Nova Scotians was raised by a father who was a miserable, violent abuser. He had no real friends and no positive role models. The abused, friendless boy that was Gabriel Wortman grew into a violent, manipulative adult who sought relative wealth and power on the margins of society. The MCC engaged in what seemed to be a deliberate murkiness regarding Wortman's associations with criminals in the years prior to his deadly killing spree. This is particularly unfortunate, bordering on suspicious, considering the question was foundational to what the public was hoping to discover through the MCC process. The public has been disappointed with the MCC in this regard and has had to look elsewhere for information. The RCMP has said it could not find any evidence of organized crime connections in Wortman's past, and the MCC has not taken timely or meaningful independent steps to figure it out for themselves. There was a report released after the proceedings were completed, which concluded that Wortman was not a police agent. This report was only 7 pages long and had a correspondingly narrow focus. Fortunately, others have reported on the subject with help from several police sources. The Mass Casualty Commission took some time to focus on Wortman's extensive history of violence with people other than his spouse. There was a presentation of a foundational document summarizing Wortman's violent encounters with others, followed by a witness, Wortman's former neighbor, Brenda Forbes. Ms. Forbes knew about some key incidents of violence and had reported Wortman to the police. Wortman appears to have been a person who routinely used physical violence throughout his adult life. With men, he would either seek out or be easily provoked into violence. With women, he was sexually aggressive and persistent in his advances. Years ago, he pled guilty to assaulting a teenage boy, but received a discharge, meaning he would not have a criminal record. He would break dentures and threaten customers who did not pay on time. Brenda Forbes' testimony, in part, demonstrated how far people can go and yet still not get in any trouble with the police. Ms. Forbes and her husband George both had long careers in the military and were looking to settle down into retirement in Portapic. They built the home that they eventually sold to John Zoll and Joanne Thomas, who were killed by Wortman. He burned their home to the ground. There were 3 main incidents described by Miss Forbes. The first was when Miss Banfield came to her home after having been assaulted by Wortman. Miss Banfield refused to seek help or intervention, despite Miss Forbes urging her to do so and offering help. The second was after Miss Forbes told Miss Banfield and Wortman's uncle, Glenn Wortman, that Wortman was regularly cheating on Miss Banfield. Wortman threatened Miss Forbes after Glenn told him that Miss Forbes had told on him. The third was when Glenn Wortman told Miss Forbes that he saw Wortman choking Miss Banfield in front of him and 2 other men. Miss Forbes called the police, who told her that there needed to be a direct witness in order to proceed with charges. Miss Forbes tried to get Glenn to speak to the police, but he refused. She says this conversation with the police was in person, and she called Glenn over speakerphone to ask if he would testify, but Glenn refused to cooperate, explaining that if he did, his nephew would kill him if he knew he had done so. The officer was able to hear the conversation according to Miss Forbes. Constable Troy Maxwell was this officer, who denies that the complaint was related to domestic violence. His notes, however, are consistent with the complaint as described by Miss Forbes. Miss Forbes and her husband sold their home and moved to Halifax, and then, when she learned Wortman had a place in Dartmouth, they made the dramatic decision to leave Nova Scotia. They lost $100,000 in the process of having to sell and move. The other incident, unrelated to Miss Forbes, where further police intervention may have been pushed further, involves a police bulletin from Halifax police officer Corporal Densmore in 2011. An anonymous source stated to Corporal Densmore that Wortman wanted to kill a police officer. Corporal Densmore added this to the provincial criminal intelligence database as it was outside his jurisdiction, but nothing seems to have happened in terms of follow-up. Other incidents that stuck out were contained in the foundational documents. One involved a woman who dated Wortman in 2000, who went to his place in Dartmouth only to have a uniformed RCMP officer show up unannounced without knocking, and who, when seeing her there, made up some excuse and left. This witness had apparently given a previous interview to the MCC, but for some unstated reason, that has not been published. Another involves a man named Kip Mackenzie. Mackenzie and Wortman had a disagreement over a property deal in Fredericton where Mackenzie acquired a property that Wortman felt entitled to own for some reason. Wortman had traveled to Pictou about a month before the killings and may have been trying to find and kill Mackenzie. Unfortunately, the MCC did not probe very deeply into this aspect of Wortman's past. Though they did not say so directly, they seemed to want to avoid any unnecessary delving into his past so as to avoid giving him any notoriety. Perhaps this was seen as a way of discouraging others from following a similar path. Wealth accumulation. There were two property deals where Wortman seems to have engaged in somewhat informal property dealings that ended up in conflict. When Wortman purchased his first Portapique property, his father Paul loaned him some money to assist and had his name on the deed as security. When Wortman paid his father back, Paul refused to sign over his interest in the property. Later, Wortman did the same thing to his uncle Glenn, demanding an additional $70,000 before he would take his name off a property. I say they must have been informal agreements, as these kinds of situations are routinely handled without trouble by property lawyers. If someone is taking their name off a property in exchange for $50,000, then the regular process would be for them to provide their lawyer with a signed deed to be held in trust while awaiting payment. The payor provides the money to their lawyer, who holds it in trust pending receipt of the signed deed. Once both lawyers are satisfied, there is an exchange, the new deed is recorded, and everyone goes about their lives. That this did not occur with Wortman is a sign that something underhanded or riskily informal was taking place. The Mass Casualty Commission took some time to explore this. The Financial Misdealings foundational document gave a window into the degree of illegal activity in which Gabriel Wortman was engaged. One of the early details that emerged about Wortman was that he had hidden large quantities of cash in fireproof containers on his property and had seemingly been living well beyond what might be expected of a denturist. He had a nice cottage, a large secondary building, seemingly designed for large parties, had multiple vehicles, took trips south every couple of months, and had expensive hobbies. The foundational document presentation provided some guidance as to Wortman's illegal financial activities. He regularly took cash for denturist work, defrauded insurance companies to the benefit of his clients, and underreported his income from his legitimate denturist work. We later learned that he took advantage sexually of some of his clients who were beneficiaries of his fraudulent schemes. The killer has been described as a grievance collector, and many motives have been speculated for some of the various individuals who became his victims during the mass shooting. There were some past romantic relationships, house and estate disagreements, personal slights, and alleged organized crime connections. None have clearly emerged as the most obvious or compelling explanation. There were also allegations from 2000 and 2001 that Wortman committed arson on buildings near his denture clinic in Dartmouth in order so that he could purchase them at lower values. Despite that, the possibility that the fires he set to his cottage and warehouse were originally intended to be part of an insurance fraud plan was never seriously explored. Perhaps he was thinking of adding the recently withdrawn $475,000 in cash as part of such a claim, and that the cash found in fireproof boxes below his destroyed cottage, which he may have thought he could secretly recover at a later time, was also part of such a plan. Of course, no motive is a justification for murder, but examining these motives and the potential police awareness of them may give us a sense of the predictability of such criminal activity in Nova Scotia. Here, many have come forward after the fact to say that the killer could be unpredictably violent, particularly when drinking, held irrational grievances, and had an antisocial and violent upbringing. Some people with that personality matrix go to counseling or develop healthier friendships as they grow to adulthood and go about their lives as productive citizens. Others become Gabriel Wortman. If you take that kind of personality, then add guns and a negative life shock of some kind, things can become very dangerous. How much of the personal information that might prevent such a rare event can or should be known to police intelligence? It is hard to tell. We heard that Wortman was on the police radar, but that the radar was turned off. In other words, there was lots of information available to police if anyone had thought to connect the threads. Evidently, the criminal intelligence functions of Nova Scotia policing is lacking. From the legal battle over the disclosure of search warrant documents, which predated the MCC, we have learned little of what was known and done by police intelligence in the aftermath of the shootings. After the killings, the RCMP claimed to be doing ongoing investigations, and there was noted in stories at the time to be speculation that there may have been co-conspirators. Various leads were investigated in that regard, and the commissioners should have been able to find out about what suspicions police may have had. The MCC did not, however, call evidence on that question during the 75 days of proceedings. Wortman seems to have been a known weapons and drug smuggler who crossed the U.S. border regularly in the course of his activities. He had connections through friends with criminal organizations, possibly had connections with prison guards, was unusually rich for a denturist, had purchased police articles online, and yet had nothing on his record other than a speeding ticket. If the RCMP knew of Wortman in this sense, they should have disclosed it so that it could be examined. There were, and still are, theories circulating which have not been compellingly refuted among people who are engrossed in the facts of this matter. For these people and many others, bare denials will not be sufficient. Was he newly identified as a smuggler and concerned about going to prison? Was he a confidential informant who had been outed to dangerous criminal organizations? If the RCMP and the Criminal Intelligence Service did not know about him, despite factors that make him seem like the kind of guy who might be identified as a person of interest, then we need to look at the structure of our policing and ask why someone like this was not better known. That was not done during the course of the MCC, nor was there ever an answer given as to why the RCMP and MCC seemed to get so little help or cooperation from American authorities in their investigation into how Wortman acquired his illegal firearms. Wortman also gained substantial wealth from the estate of his friend Tom Evans, a New Brunswick lawyer who had his law license suspended over allegations he plied underage boys with alcohol and with whom Wortman may have had a sexual relationship. It appears that the two were also involved in the illegal drug trade. There are witness accounts of this, and the MCC was able to find a receipt that appears to be notes from a cannabis drug deal for 5 pounds of cannabis. All of this seems to relate to the $475,000 that Wortman picked up from the Brinks location in Burnside. The source of that money is not known other than it was previously held by Wortman in the CIBC. Much of it was likely generated through illegal activities. There was also considerable speculation that Wortman was a confidential police informant who was being paid out at the end of his service to the RCMP in this large chunk of money, in this unusual manner. Usually cash, even such quantities, is provided to clients at the branch, where their identification can be verified by the branch manager. Informants would more likely be paid by getting a ticket that they would bring to Brinks and be given a bag of cash to which it relates without further formalities. The foundational document would suggest that it was not the case that Wortman received his money directly from the RCMP. There are communications from internal CIBC officials discussing Wortman's request for the funds. This seems to put to rest the suggestion that the funds were provided by the RCMP, though certainly they could have been paying Wortman in cash previously, and he could have been accumulating the cash in and about his home and other buildings. The RCMP has denied that Wortman was an informant, but their own internal rules permit them to lie to anyone other than a judge in court about whether someone is an informant. The MCC does not count as a court in this sense. The other, additional, or alternate suggestion for the accumulation of the $705,000 that was found on his property and the value of his assets along with his relatively lavish lifestyle was that Wortman was dealing in drugs on a larger scale. We have evidence that he was smuggling weapons across the Canada-US border, so it would not be beyond the realm of possibility that he would also be smuggling drugs into the country, either directly himself or by boat, as has been suggested. This might help explain why Wortman was trying to buy up properties in coastal, relatively isolated Portapique. Domestic assault investigation privilege. Constable Maxwell was the officer who spoke with Brenda Forbes about a complaint Miss Forbes made. There was a stark contrast between the two versions of events described by the two of them, and were this a criminal trial, the judge would need to make a choice as to what to believe. I suspect the commissioners are going to try their best to avoid commenting on the credibility of any individual witness in their final report, but since it relates to a key issue, they may have to do so here. Miss Forbes says that she complained to the police about a domestic assault on Lisa Banfield. Constable Maxwell says the complaint was reckless driving around Portapique by Wortman. A trial judge in this situation might note that while Constable Maxwell does many investigations, and so this one might not stick out in his mind, a civilian who makes a complaint does so rarely and so is likely to recall it more vividly. Secondly, Constable Maxwell stated in his interview with the MCC that there was a decommissioned RCMP vehicle at Wortman's which formed part of the complaint. But we know that Wortman did not have a decommissioned RCMP vehicle in 2013. Finally, the notes from Constable Maxwell name all of the witnesses to the assault that Miss Forbes identified and note nothing about driving. The notes, which Constable Maxwell made at the time of the original call, are consistent with Miss Forbes' account. Miss Forbes had some trouble giving her testimony, which was not addressed by her or MCC lawyer Emily Hill. She was shaking at times and had some moments of memory slips, things which can detract from a witness's testimony or credibility. If I were examining Miss Forbes, I would have asked her directly about her health, as a way of explaining the way she appeared to be shaking. It may have just been nerves. She stated in later questions to lawyer Megan Stevens that she had a stutter. Whatever it was, she had the courage to overcome it and testify, which is a useful comparator to the police officers who were unwilling to summon the same level of bravery. It is relevant as Miss Forbes' account being accurate would mean the police were made aware of Wortman's abusive behavior and his ownership of firearms. The police could have followed up on the violence complaint and seen in their files that he had a history of violence. They could have also noted that he did not have a license to possess firearms and could have followed up on that aspect as well. The testimony from Miss Forbes and Constable Maxwell brings to mind how the issue of privilege might apply to Wortman. In a sense, he was given several passes by police because of his privilege, a loaded term which must be applied in a relative manner to Wortman. In the relatively short time frame between 2010 and 2013, there was very detailed, disturbing, documented information in the hands of police about the perpetrator's continuum of violence, intimate partner violence, and access to firearms. Yet, no meaningful or effective action resulted from this information. This was all in addition to the fact that over the 19 years they were together, Wortman seemingly regularly abused Miss Banfield, and it was known to people in his family and the Portapique community. There was evidence provided through the MCC that Wortman sexually assaulted, exploited, and harmed people. He bragged about or openly displayed his criminal activities. He showed people illegal firearms. He shot them off. He told people he was a criminal operator and showed them illegal firearms while living a lifestyle well beyond legitimate means. Starting with the threat investigation in 2010, we learned that despite very specific and reliable information about his threat to kill his parents and then his father Paul Wortman's information about the firearms, there was no real action taken. Instead, the matter was referred by the RCMP to Constable Greg Wiley, who was friendly with Wortman, to determine if he had access to firearms. He did a very cursory investigation, if he did any at all. Constable Wiley did not recall getting the referral. The file was then closed after Wortman told Constable Wiley that he did not have any working firearms. There was a Canadian Police Information Centre appendix entry made by the Halifax Regional Police about the 2010 threat, which flagged the perpetrator as a firearms interest, an entry which should have been visible on the police-utilized database CPIC until 2015. Then, in 2011, an anonymous and specific tip was issued through a Criminal Intelligence Service of Nova Scotia Officer Safety Bulletin warning about Wortman wanting to kill a cop. This was a threat to kill police, and it gave very specific information about firearms, where to find firearms, and information that Wortman's mental health was deteriorating. From there, however, no officer conducted a meaningful investigation. If Wortman was a young black or indigenous man rather than a white, somewhat educated male of quasi-professional status and a business owner with multiple properties and vehicles, it seems unlikely that a bare denial would have been sufficient to close the matter. Next was the 2013 complaint by Brenda Forbes, who said she filed a complaint with the RCMP of the killer assaulting and choking Miss Banfield at the Portapic cottage he owned. I expect that the commissioners will accept Miss Forbes' account and will find a way to politely suggest that Constable Maxwell was mistaken about his recall, given the time that has passed and the number of files that he has had to deal with in the meantime. Certainly, Constable Maxwell has an incentive to stick to his story, as admitting he failed to follow up on a report of a serious domestic violence complaint would potentially implicate both him and the RCMP more broadly. What likely occurred in listening to the two versions of the events is that Constable Maxwell was given the information in July 2013 that Miss Forbes said she gave him about Miss Banfield, but realizing that he did not have a convictable offense as he had an uncooperative witness, he wrote it off. These events each represent a missed opportunity for intervention, a concrete example of how Wortman's relative privilege got him a pass. Aaron Breen, lawyer for Leaf and the Avalon Sexual Assault Center, said that this is one of the consequences of the pro-arrest, pro-charge, pro-conviction policy currently in place in this province. The emphasis is on police action for convictable violence and not on protection from violence. She suggests there should be a different approach, one focused on behavior change and responsibility acceptance through education, individual counseling, and restorative justice programs for offenders. Wortman's history also raises serious concerns about police information sharing, continuity, and purging policies. It is a problem because effective policing, we are told, must be intelligence-led, and if there is no intelligence about such an individual over this lengthy period of time, then there is something wrong. Either the RCMP is concealing what it knew about Wortman, or else their policing is ineffective and public safety is compromised. Police connections. There has also been excellent reporting on the criminal intelligence angle from Nova Scotia-based investigative journalist Paul Palango, who has a history of reporting on the RCMP and organized crime going back to his days in Hamilton and his time with the Globe and Mail. Palango has developed a network of sources within the RCMP and other police forces through which he has been able to find out information that the MCC seems inclined or even determined to ignore. It was Palango's reporting that first identified the large withdrawal of cash from the Brinks facility in Burnside by Wortman shortly before the shootings, and showed how that had the hallmarks of an undercover operation. Palango has reported that in 2015, Atlantic Canadian police agencies started noticing that outlaw biker gangs had started re-establishing themselves in the region, 15 years after a major effort had been made to expel them. Their goal was to control the illegal drug trade in this part of the country. A joint forces operation called Project Hogwarts was started in 2016, involving members of the RCMP and Halifax Regional Police. This was supported by National RCMP Commissioner Robert Paulson, who stated at the time that his top crime-fighting objective was outlaw biker gangs. Palango reports that the police developed a lead on a biker who was traveling between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick during that time, which led to the New Brunswick RCMP developing their own biker gang response unit. In 2017, the Project Hogwarts team was told that the RCMP had an informant in the Truro-Portapic area who was tied into the gangs. People familiar with the names of those in the Portapique community may wonder whether that person was Peter Griffin, Wortman's neighbor who assisted him with obtaining the RCMP decals that Wortman placed on his plain decommissioned cruiser, which turned it into an exact replica RCMP car. Griffin was reputed to have ties to local, Western Canadian, and Mexican criminal organizations. Palango, however, notes that Griffin was in jail in Alberta during 2017-18 and so could not have been the source. Therefore, it seems likely that Wortman was the source, possibly being handled by frequent visitor Constable Wiley, who last visited Wortman in 2017 and took, or at least disclosed, no notes of his 15 or so visits. Project Hogwarts ended on April 9, 2020, just 9 days prior to the shooting rampage, when RCMP Inspector De Silva announced that 2 Hells Angels and 2 Red Devils had been arrested and that they were linked to 2 earlier arrests where cocaine and weapons were discovered. The end of an operation is a dangerous time, as other criminal associates tend to figure out who the rat may have been and act to eliminate those who provided information to the police. The theory behind this information is that Wortman was identified as a snitch, had his life threatened, and was embittered towards the RCMP as a result. Psychology of a killer. In the aftermath of the April 18th, 19th, 2020 Nova Scotia Mass Shooting, the RCMP prepared what they called a psychological autopsy of Gabriel Wortman. This document has not been published by the Mass Casualty Commission, but the MCC has published 2 reports from 2 experts in the field which analyzed the RCMP report. The authors are Christy Martyr, a professor at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia, and Tess Neal, a professor at the University of Arizona. It is not often clear why certain experts were chosen by the MCC, but one factor that did not appear to figure into their choice is cost. Both Miss Martyr and Miss Neal appeared in person in Halifax, rather than testifying by video as many other witnesses and panelists have done. I note this as it raises for me a question as to why none of the forensic psychological expertise that is available through St. Mary's University, just up the street from the MCC proceedings, was employed. Judging by the depth of insight one might gain from the Martyr-Neal report, it seems unlikely that those from St. Mary's could not have matched the quality and perhaps done so for a fraction of the cost. These experts were not contracted to provide the RCMP with their own or an alternate forensic psychological assessment of the killer. So, we do not have access to the RCMP report and will also not receive an independent report. This seems like a shortcoming for an inquiry that, among other things, is trying to figure out why this person committed a mass shooting. We do know quite a bit about Wortman, more than I have covered here. We also had a chance to see him briefly in video footage that was captured during the shooting rampage. The video footage from Millbrook, where Wortman got out of his replica cruiser to remove his jacket, showed us his profile. He was a big, tall man, but looked very out of shape with soft shoulders and a big belly. Over the course of the MCC, we have come to learn that Wortman had an eclectic, often transactional sex life. Wortman was never going to be a successful purveyor of sex among good-looking, professional, successful people, but seemed satisfied and proud to appear to be a smart, assertive, quasi-professional, white millionaire among the marginalized segments with whom he was most comfortable and to whom he could portray superiority. He abused whatever relative privilege he could in order to get sex, perhaps in part a result of him being too socially awkward from his stilted upbringing to have the kind of charm that can bring consensual sex where the partners are on equal footing. Wortman also seemed to be unreasonably dedicated to acquiring real estate in the Portapique area. In fact, there seems to be a property or property grievance theme connecting some of the early killings by Wortman. When asked about some of the victims who were known to her, Miss Banfield noted that Wortman had tried to buy the Tuck property, and that she had complimented the Glenchen home to him. We heard from Brenda Forbes that Wortman had an issue with her and her husband George, and may have taken it out on the John Zoll and Joanne Thomas home, who bought the Forbes' home. Lisa McCulley's home had been owned by Wortman's uncle, from whom Wortman had tried unsuccessfully to swindle ownership. None of this appears to have fit into the RCMP's assessment, of which Martyr and Neal were highly critical. They did not even know what to call it, noting that it had elements of a retrospective behavioral profile and a retrospective risk assessment. The author of the report, Dr. Matt Logan, was noted not to be a certified psychologist in Canada, despite referring to himself as a criminal psychologist, a term which the experts testified does not exist in the field. The authors had evaluated the RCMP report by asking 108 designed questions and comparing the report to 8 identified best practices in the preparation of such reports. They found that 78% of the report's features were non-compliant with best practices. Without being able to see the original report, it is difficult to know what to make of such commentary. Patricia McPhee, one of the lawyers for the Federal Department of Justice, noted in her questioning of the experts that the report was prepared to assist the RCMP with their investigation, not as a research piece for a peer-reviewed academic journal. The experts said that the standards of psychological reporting must be maintained regardless of the purpose. The authors stated that the report did not account for the bias of the RCMP in this context. The RCMP has a vested interest in the outcome of the report, as their performance in anticipating and reacting to the killing spree is under scrutiny. If a report were to conclude that Wortman's actions fit into some sort of pattern that could or should have been noticed or predicted, then the RCMP's failure to do so would be all the more open to criticism. The report evidently is written with highly emotive language and included a dedication at the beginning to fallen officers. Members of the media were provided with copies of the original RCMP report. Following the MCC proceedings on Twitter, I noticed that some portions of the report were being referenced. The tweets have since been deleted, as there was a publication restriction on the contents of the report, but while they were up, I noticed that they had referenced the conclusions on each individual killing. Not incidentally, I do not see why this information would be held back. This seems like information that the public and the families could handle, having been made public. Each were classified into one of 4 categories: grievance-based, reactive, incidental random, and displacement-based. This last category is the least credible of the 4. The RCMP theorized that any of the more elderly victims likely represented to Wortman an image of his parents, who he is known to have hated. There is no reason to accept this. Other than his animosity towards his parents, there is no evidence that he considered other older adults in this manner prior to the killing spree. Some killings, like those of John Zoll and Joanne Thomas, have alternate explanations having to do with the properties they were occupying and Wortman's long-standing issues with them. The other major conclusion that the RCMP report evidently made was that Wortman's goal was the ultimate humiliation for his spouse, Lisa Banfield. The theory seems to be that his controlling behavior over many years was done in an effort to humiliate Miss Banfield, and the shooting somehow capped that off. This does not stand up to scrutiny as a motivating factor. In fact, it is much more likely that the ultimate humiliation was for the RCMP itself, whose shortcomings Wortman was able to expose through his actions. The failure to consider this as an equally or more plausible conclusion may be a result of the bias and vested interest that the RCMP had when preparing the report, though it is much more consistent with the facts to think Wortman was targeting the RCMP rather than his spouse with his plans. Making such conclusions would force the RCMP to confront uncomfortable truths about its own structure and capabilities. The MCC should have published the entire RCMP report rather than the 27-page summary, which does not delve into the details of any individual killing. They should also have commissioned an independent forensic psychological assessment to have experts examine what happened and why Wortman targeted certain individuals and bypassed others. Otherwise, we are left with an incomplete picture of the killer. Ostensibly, he had everything he wanted and was in a time and position in his life to enjoy what he had accumulated. Miss Banfield's evidence and the CIBC emails suggest he had a growing paranoia about potential societal chaos emerging from the pandemic. But even then, he was in a good position to endure and even thrive in such chaos. It does not make sense for him to have thrown it all away when he did. All right, so that's the end of part 1 of Violence of History Ignored. The next video is going to delve into part 2, which is what really happened. So hopefully you enjoyed the video or the podcast version of this, and invite you to look for the next part when it's released. Thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.